Welcome to the Founder's Code. Today, we will see about money. Why does a piece of paper or digital number has value? This is a pretty deep question with a very simple answer. Money has value because we all agree that it does. That's right. The US dollar has value because the US government says it does, and most importantly, because we the people trust that it does. Without trust, money would be worthless. Before money, before money, people traded goods directly, like swapping a cow for a haircut. But a cow isn't very useful for haircuts. So eventually someone came up with something more universally useful, something that both parties would trust to have value, something like gold. So gold became our first commodity money. The problem with gold is it's heavy and inconvenient to carry around, which led to the creation of silver and bronze coins stamped with official markings indicating their weight and purity. Eventually, these metal coins became the global standard for money. But even with coins, people still had problems. Most people didn't carry around enough coins for large purchases, so they started using pieces of paper that could be redeemed for coins. For example, during the 17th century, some Dutch banks began issuing paper money that could be exchanged for gold or silver at a later date. These were the first paper banknotes. And eventually people started accepting these banknotes without even knowing that there was any gold or silver backing them, because they trusted the bank to exchange them when necessary. And that's really the key moment in the history of money. People started using pieces of paper backed only by the trust of the issuer. In the early days, this was banks issuing banknotes backed by gold, but eventually countries took over this function and started issuing their own fiat currencies. The word fiat means let it be done and refers to the government decree that gives the currency its value. So here's how it works. The US government just says that $1 is worth 100 cents, and everyone agrees that that's true. But wait, how can a piece of paper or digital number have value if it's not backed by anything physical like gold? Well, it has value because the government says it does, and we the people trust that it does. We trust the government to keep its value stable and ensure that we can exchange it whenever we need to. But just because we trust the government doesn't mean that we trust other financial institutions any more than we trust the government. If anything, we probably trust the government more than we trust Wall Street banks. And yet Wall Street banks make more money every day than the U.S. government simply because they control the majority of the money out there. How can this be possible? Well, here's how it works. When you put your money into a bank, they only hold on to a fraction of it. The rest they lend out to someone who puts it in their bank, who then lends out a fraction of their money, and so on and so forth. This is called fractional reserve banking. And it's the reason why there's always more money out there than there are banks or bank deposits. If I put my money in a bank, they might only hold on to 10% of it. The other 90% they lend out to someone who puts it in their bank, who then lends out 90% of their money, and so on. In this way, a few dollars from one person can turn into tens of thousands of dollars throughout the economy. This is how most of the money out there is created, through fractional reserve banking. The rest of the money out there is created by the government each time they issue bonds to finance their spending. When they issue bonds, they're essentially creating new money and giving it to the people who buy the bonds. So now we have two ways of creating money, through fractional reserve banking and through the government. And it all comes down to this chart right here. When the government creates more money through bond issuance, prices go up. When the government and banks create less money, prices go down. Let me show you some real historical examples of this. During World War II, the US government created a lot of new money to pay for war bonds. By 1945, the money supply had doubled. What happened next? Inflation. Prices increased by 13%. After the war ended, the government created less money and prices started falling. Then in the 1970s, the government created a lot of new money to pay for the Vietnam War. By 1973, the money supply had tripled. What happened next? Inflation. Prices went up by almost 12%. Since the 1970s, the government and banks have been creating even more money each year to fund the growing federal budget deficit. You can see this on the chart. The blue line represents the money supply controlled by the government and banks. The orange line represents the price level. Look how closely they move together. Since the 1970s, the government and banks have been creating more money each year, leading to inflation. Prices have gone up 300% since 1970. Now, if you look back at history, you can find other examples of rapid inflation, hyperinflation. For example, in Germany after World War I, The government created a lot of new money to pay for war reparations. By 1923, the money supply had increased 4,000%. What happened next? Inflation. Prices went up 3,000%. People needed to carry around wheelbarrows of cash for basic goods and services. At one point, a German newspaper cost 200 billion marks. Eventually, they just gave up on the Weimar currency and adopted the D-mark. Another example is Zimbabwe after its independence from British colonial rule. They experienced hyperinflation, too. The Zimbabwean dollar became so worthless that they stopped producing banknotes. Instead, they started using the South African rand. These are just a few examples of what happens when too much money is created. So it's important to understand who controls the money supply and how they control it. Well, the answer is central banks. Central banks control the money supply by raising and lowering interest rates. Raising interest rates decreases the money supply and lowers inflation. Lowering interest rates increases the money supply and raises inflation. For example, the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. When it wants to increase the money supply, it lowers interest rates, which encourages banks to lend out more money, which creates more money. So higher interest rates decrease the money supply and lower inflation, and lower interest rates increase the money supply and raise inflation. Now this is all fine and good, but I bet you don't see much of these transactions with cash anymore. Instead, you probably use cards, online banking, and mobile payments. And this trend will continue as more people demand cashless policies and cryptocurrencies become more popular. Digital money is becoming more and more prevalent, but will it ever be able to replace physical cash? Well, this is the big idea behind CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. Essentially a digital version of the US dollar issued and controlled by the Federal Reserve. The benefit would be that it would make transactions easier and cheaper, but the downside is that it would give the government even more control over our money. If we had a cashless society where everything was done digitally, the government would have complete control over our money. It could tax us on every transaction and even freeze our accounts whenever it wanted to. Now that may sound like a far-fetched dystopian nightmare, but it is already happening in China, where the government is forcing its citizens to adopt the digital yuan. So if we want to prevent a dystopia, we need to understand how money really works. We need to be careful of who we give power to, and we need to remember that money is just a tool. It's just a piece of paper or a digital number. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. It only has the value that we give it. And if we lose faith in that value, it will all come crashing down. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos.